So, Mark, why don't you tell me a bit about Alive and your role there?
Okay, so I'm CEO and founder of Alive, and we are a digital transformation consultancy, basically a boutique management consultancy that focuses on supporting organisations through large-scale change that's being driven by technology fundamentally. We're not doing the do, we're not, we don't have all the people, the technologists or the integrators and so on. We're much more at that strategy, coaching, leadership, organisational change end of it, trying to keep everything on track, essentially.
I suppose a lot of the people who are going to be listening to this, which are chief data officers, they want to know the role that data plays in changing an organisation. If you can give a bit of insight into how being data-driven as a culture can improve organisational practices.
Yeah, I think it is real basic, simple version. I think, there's particularly sectors of the economy that are highly fragmented. So, agriculture, supply chain, healthcare, education, those areas where there's a lot of deep specialisation in their particular field, but they don't have access to a lot of information. Those areas are the areas that need to transform. They need to modernise. They need to build, increase the pace of technology development and adoption. That fragmentation makes it really hard. So the democratisation of data is one way of speeding that up. I suppose that's kind of at its basic level. I think at the other level, if we're actually starting to think about what does democratisation of data do, and you need to sort of come back to how's education changing, how are people changing, how's the job market changing, not just now, but in the next sort of 10 years. If you think about ChatGPT, everybody loves talking about it. What has that actually done to education? My speech, I was using an example with my son, who I walked into his room, and all of a sudden he was speaking Russian at me, and I was asking him, "Are you learning Russian at school?" And he said, "No, I'm not." And I said, "Well, where is he getting it from?" He showed me his computer. He'd logged into my instance of ChatGPT. He'd created his own Russian tutor and was learning how to speak Russian based on that. And I was just like, right there and then, just going, "Oh my God, that's education changing." And then, spent some time thinking about that and realising that the way that we test for knowledge in the education system is no longer valid. The way that we tested for knowledge was originally how to write an essay or fill in some, all of that's gone. What's really important now is how do we help people become much deeper experts in their field so they can ask more insightful questions, and then much better at critical thought when they get an answer, so they can say, what's right, what's wrong, what's the 10% that needs improving, and how do I put my own personal experience into the answer to make it more relevant and meaningful. And then, so then when you're talking about the democratization of data and data culture, that's how you do those two things. You give people the ability to sort through information and work their way through it so they can think about more insightful questions.
And that example with your son is incredibly interesting, because what a lot of people worry about with things like generative AI is it going to make us stupider? But how your son had used it is to educate himself. And yes, I am meant to be a really good data scientist, but I used it the other day to help me write an Excel formula that I was having incredible trouble with. And it still took about 4 or 5 times to get it right. But the learning for me was asking it the right question, phrasing it in the right way, because it's still how the model's trained, still has that black box effect, and you kind of need to work out how to tease out the right information.
Absolutely. I think, we've all been in a room, I think, of very smart, intelligent people discussing a problem, and everybody fills up the air. Everybody's talking and they're all trying to position themselves. And there's quite often that one, usually quite senior person, who's sitting there quietly, who right at the end of it just asks the most insightful question that makes everybody sit back and go, "Oh, yeah, I hadn't thought about that." And I think that's the talent that needs to be developed, the data side of things. How do we develop that insight with people in their jobs now, but into the future, of being able to sort through information and see the insight through that, and then ask a really, really deep, insightful question, so then we can start to change the way things work.
And you said something interesting as well that talked about democratization and that maybe the education structures are wrong. I always felt like that for a lot of students, they get exposed to statistical concepts only at the university level. Even quite basic things like hypothesis testing, what a distribution is. A lot of the higher grade mathematics at high school is developed on calculus, inferential or differential. And I think it's interesting that these statistical concepts are only being taught later. They're not really reinforced much throughout the rest of the learning journey in universities. And when you get to the point where you're in a business decision, the issue with democratization is, do people have the right knowledge to make decisions based on data?
It's super interesting question, and I love it. I mean, I love the kind of where that's going, because, to me, that's what I was saying. How do we teach critical thought in the education system? How do we teach critical thought to our staff now in our organisations? But then if we're in maybe in government organisations, or you're having something to do with education, how do we think about actually purposefully and intentfully teaching critical thought? The reason why that's interesting, of course, is because as students are going through their education journey and are learning to be more critical, more insightful the way they're actually analysing information, the impetus around understanding that data and then the relevance of the mathematics and statistical analysis around it becomes even more interesting. So for them, it's no longer just something I have to learn, it's something that helps me get to the end point that I'm trying to explore.
And when you get to democratization and you start looking at things like generative AI, there's a lot to be understood when it comes to bias. People understanding how models are trained, and that there are inherent flaws in these systems that are getting better but might never be fixed, right? And we need to be aware of them.
I mean, we all know that kind of the idea that there is bias, and it's there. I think, as we evolved, a lot of that bias is going to start to be addressed over time. I think there is, the regulatory space is really important right now, in terms of how data is used, how AI is used, and in particular as the next wave of these kind of, this kind of generative AI models will become more and more personalised, which means all the data that I create as an individual needs to be centralised and put into one spot. That has huge amounts of ethical issues around it, and they're already, by nature, there's going to be bias built into that, because if that person's individual biases will be built into that data model. So yeah, lots of issues to start to deal with, but then also a huge economic cycle on the back of it. If we actually start to think that the bank of my data, which is a market category that doesn't really exist now, it kind of exists in terms of, but it's being used for advertising mostly. The bank of my data is a market category that probably needs to exist, and it is, orders of magnitude larger than anything that we've seen before in terms of, social media research or something.
Yeah, there's that exponential growth of data, and it's incredible the amount of information that's out there and the new tools that we have to process it as well. I know that you talked previously about convergence.
Yep.
One of the big convergences that I've seen over the past maybe 5-10 years, particularly in data, is visualization tools with analytic tools, because increasingly we want to do the analysis and be able to visualize it where it is. Are there any other big convergences that you're seeing in the technology world, specifically with data?
I mean, the way I think about technology convergence, I think at kind of like at a societal level or like a economic sector level. So prime example, like when COVID first hit, there was, one of the biggest problems around the healthcare sector was essentially how do people in particularly remote areas get the care that they need. Basically people couldn't jump on planes. Now there was telehealth and a few other things, but there was also robotic surgery. And at that point in time, there was one supplier of surgery robots in the world, and it was fairly limited in the number of procedures it could do. It's, moving to today, there's about 4 or 5 different suppliers of surgery robots in the world. Sophistication is going up exponentially. They're building an AI behind those things to actually learning and making sure that the error rate can basically be removed. You can start to have natural conversations with those. And of course, you've got things like 5G and the new connectivity, which is then enabling those robots to be able to move and transfer data at increasingly fast rates. So what we're seeing there is how those different technologies are coming together to fundamentally transform part of the healthcare system. And I would say the same thing's happening again in all of those highly fragmented parts of the economy, so agriculture, healthcare, etc., education, very, very much so. All of those different parts of technology coming together to drive fundamental change in the way that sector works.
And it's interesting because I was talking to somebody that's in an agricultural role recently, and they had a concern around the amount of data they've been capturing over the past couple of years that could feed better agricultural practices. But we were in a La Nina cycle, and we could hit into this El Nino, and the validity of the information for them to make underpinned decisions if things like weather cycles are going to change. So I found that particularly fascinating as well.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I think if you look at kind of the big global economic cycles that we've been through, if you sort of go back to the global financial crisis, when that hit, the biggest issue that every organisation in the world, more or less every organisation in the world had, was how do I find, engage and retain a customer? Because social media had exploded, search had exploded, the customer space had completely changed. Now, of course, that drove a huge amount of investment into data capture, retention, storage, understanding, then moving into things like marketing automation, then moving into things like, how, sort of the standardization of digital marketing at scale. Also the adoption of CRM models, all of these kinds of things all happened because of that. And around all of that were organisations changing their strategy to be more customer-centred, bringing in capabilities like human-centred design. All of these new things were starting to happen. If we move through to today, how do I find and engage and retain a customer? It's a bit more well known. We know roughly, because it's a mature space, roughly how much money we need to spend, what kind of tactics, what kind of channels, roughly what we're going to get back for it. How do I find, engage and retain talent? Way more hard. How do I get more revenue from the customers I've already got? Far, far more difficult. Of course, organisational efficiency is really important, but organisational efficiency, so what technologies do I create an efficient organisation that isn't going to send me down a pathway that I can't undo? So what are the emerging technologies and how do I build them into our operations and efficiency models?
And that's interesting as well because there's this balance to be had, right? Which is using data to drive decisions, but also relying on those traits that make us inherently human and the experience that we have previously, knowing how to communicate, when we incentivize people, how to reward them in a way that's maybe not necessarily financial, but giving them the right training or giving them the right recognition. Yep. So there is this combination between data and personability, right?
100%. Yeah, I mean, data is like the blood in which that makes the kind of machine work. Basically, it's everything there. It's the signals that are there. It's the insights. It's how you design the recognition. It's how you communicate to different groups. All those kinds of things is driven by the data, and then it's sort of creating a very strong, brave vision about where you're going to go and how you use that data to create a new future.